Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita. All right, diving right in today, we're taking a look at, well, this is interesting research, actually. It was part of the session readings for the virtual summer school in entrepreneurship research for 2025.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's actually a big deal, isn't it? It's the 5th year of that program this year.
Yeah, that's right. 5 years. Started back in 2021.
No fee either. Really.
Yeah, it's a no-fee initiative. Really valuable for people in the field, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. Huge for the field.
And we really have to give credit where credit's due. All thanks to Professor Vishal K. Gupta and PhD candidate Athena Skiadopoulou. Both from the University of Alabama.
Okay, yeah.
They're the ones that spearheaded this whole thing.
Wow, that's fantastic. What a great initiative to kick off and obviously keep going for 5 years. It's a real contribution, I'd say.
Definitely. And, speaking of contributions, the area of entrepreneurship that we're diving into today is informal entrepreneurship.
I.e., right.
I.e., exactly. I.e.,
Yeah.
It might not be something that's always at the forefront of our minds, but the impact globally is, it's huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's unpack this a little bit. When we talk about informal, what are we actually talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a good place to start is with the definition for the paper we're looking at today.
Okay.
And they define it as entrepreneurial activities that are illegal, yet remain legitimate to large groups in a society.
Illegal but legitimate. That seems almost like a contradiction, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's almost a bit of a paradox. But you can think about it like, think about unregistered businesses.
Right.
Or, somebody selling goods or services without the permits, the official stamps of approval, that sort of thing.
Right.
Or transactions that are kind of deliberately kept off the books. It's this interesting gray area where, the legal framework is not really adhered to, but socially it's kind of accepted.
Yeah, I see. Can you give me like a concrete example of where that distinction, where that line might be a little bit blurry?
Yeah, for sure. A good example is like a street vendor.
Yeah.
In a developing country, maybe.
Okay.
They might not have their required permits from, the local authorities.
Right.
And technically, that would make their activity illegal.
Uh-huh.
But for the community, where they are, it's seen as, totally legitimate. Necessary even.
Absolutely.
And it really provides for their livelihood. And it's a part of the local economy. So you've got these two perspectives that are kind of clashing.
Yeah.
And it raises the question of, well, when does that illegal aspect become more important than the legitimate aspect?
Yeah.
Especially in the eyes of policymakers, for instance.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about how it's this complex kind of paradox, illegal yet legitimate. You mentioned that the global impact is huge. Like, how prevalent are we talking?
Oh, it's massive. The paper we're looking at today, they cite the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, the GM report, and they found that in developed and transition economies, i.e., accounts for something like 60% of all entrepreneurial activity.
60%. That's a lot higher than I would guessed.
Yeah, it's a lot, right?
Yeah.
Especially for more developed economies, you think it'll be much less.
Exactly.
But then, and this is the really crazy part, when you look at developing economies, it goes up to 90%.
Wow. 90%. So this isn't just like a small little thing on the side. This is a significant portion of economic activity.
It's huge. It suggests that for a lot of people around the world, i.e. isn't some, side hustle. It's the main way they participate in the economy. It really kind of changes how you think about the world and about how economies function, doesn't it?
Absolutely. When I think about those numbers, my mind immediately goes to, well, what are the downsides? Governments missing out on tax revenue, for example.
Sure.
Or, businesses that are playing by the rules feeling like they're at a disadvantage.
Yeah, no, those are valid concerns.
Right.
Absolutely. And the paper acknowledges those potential negative macro level consequences. Yeah. But there's another side to this, a really important side.
Okay.
And in lots of developing and transition economies, i.e. is really a safety net. It provides income. It provides employment for people who might not have other options.
So in a sense, it's necessity breeding innovation in a way.
Exactly.
But what about in more developed economies where the percentage is lower but still significant at 60%? What's the role of IE there?
Well, even in developed economies, IE can drive innovation. Think about, disruptive technologies or new business models, things that might at least initially operate outside of the traditional regulatory frameworks.
Okay, yeah.
Sometimes those kind of informal experiments can actually create whole new industries or force regulations to change. And one of the things that I found fascinating in the paper is they actually talk about this category of informal affluent.
Informal affluent.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily that they lack resources. They have resources, but they might be choosing to operate outside of formal structures for specific reasons. Maybe they want to avoid bureaucracy, maybe they're experimenting with something really disruptive, or maybe they're tapping into these niche social networks that are really important for what they're doing. So it challenges the idea that informality is always driven by need,
Right. So, with this huge scale and the potential for both challenges and innovation, has IE always been, a big focus for researchers?
I'd say that scholarly attention has definitely grown in recent decades. Given how prevalent it is, it's not surprising that there's more and more research coming out, particularly in leading journals.
Yeah.
It's become clear that this is something that we need to understand.
But with more and more research, it can get really difficult to see the big picture.
Oh, absolutely.
Where do you even start?
Yeah, it's overwhelming, isn't it? And that's actually one of the main reasons why this research paper we're talking about is so useful. There's so many studies out there, right? Different fields too. Management, economics, sociology, political science. It's hard to get a clear overview.
Yeah, it's like, you're in this forest and you can't see the trees I guess in this case, you can't see the forest for the trees.
Exactly. It's hard to see the key takeaways, where the gaps are.
So this deep dive is kind of trying to do that, right? To give us that bird's eye view. What were the big questions that these researchers were trying to answer?
Yeah, well, I think their main focus was really on trying to understand the different kinds of informal entrepreneurs out there.
Okay.
How do they vary? How are they different across different contexts?
Yeah.
What are the main activities they're involved in? And why are they doing this? And also, what are the consequences for themselves, but also for the wider economy and society as a whole?
So with all these studies, hundreds of studies, how do they actually approach this in a rigorous way?
Well, they use what's called an integrative review, which basically means they looked at a ton of research, specifically 352 peer-reviewed journal articles.
Wow.
And they synthesized all that information, and from that, they tried to find new insights. And the process they used is called inductive coding, which basically means they didn't go in with any preconceived ideas. They let the patterns emerge from the data.
So it's like you have this huge box of Legos and you just start sorting them by color and shape and size without any idea what you're going to build.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then from that, you can start to see what's possible. And one of the cool things that came out of this process was they created this new typology, this way of categorizing informal entrepreneurs.
So it's not just informal versus formal. There are different types of informal entrepreneurs.
Exactly. And they used two main dimensions to create these categories. One is the degree of informality. So, how far outside the legal framework are they operating? And the other is socioeconomic status. So, what kind of resources do they have access to? What's their position in society? And this typology really emphasizes that informal entrepreneur is not a one-size-fits-all label.
Right. And it wasn't just about, putting them in a box and that's it. The research also looked at how that level of formality can change over time.
Yeah, definitely. They introduced this dynamic perspective by identifying 3 different pathways that informal entrepreneurs can take.
Okay.
So first, you've got reactive formalizing. This is where an entrepreneur is responding to some kind of external pressure or opportunity to become more formal.
Okay, makes sense.
And then you've got proactive formalizing, which is more about the entrepreneur trying to actively change the rules of the game, trying to change regulations to become legitimate.
Okay.
And then, and this one might be a bit surprising, there's informalizing, which is where entrepreneurs actually increase their level of informality.
So moving in the opposite direction.
Yeah, exactly. And that might be in response to things like increased regulatory burdens or a change in the market.
So it's not just a one-way street. There's movement in both directions.
Absolutely. It's very dynamic. And this framework really helps us understand not just who informal entrepreneurs are, but how they behave and how informality itself evolves over time.
So to wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways here? What are the really important things for our listeners to remember about IE?
I think the most important thing is that IE is incredibly diverse. It's not one thing. There are different types of informal entrepreneurs.
Right.
And the paper's typology really highlights that. You've got the informal poor, you've got the informal affluent, you've got semi-formal entrepreneurs at different socioeconomic levels. And these aren't just theoretical categories. They represent real differences in how these entrepreneurs operate and why.
And those three pathways, reactive formalizing, proactive formalizing, and informalizing, they show that it's not a static thing, right?
Exactly. It's not just about being formal or informal.
Yeah.
It's about how these things change over time.
Yeah.
External pressures can push entrepreneurs towards formality, but some are also trying to change the system itself.
Right.
And sometimes they become even more informal. Understanding these pathways is key to understanding how informal economies work, why they exist, why they stick around, and when they might shift.
Now, the paper also talked about the importance of legitimacy, not just in the legal sense, right?
That's right, yeah. One of the key insights is that informal entrepreneurs are always dealing with different types of legitimacy.
Okay.
There's the obvious one, the regulatory legitimacy, which is about following the law. But then there's also normative legitimacy, which is about whether what they're doing is seen as socially acceptable, morally right.
Right.
And then there's cognitive legitimacy, which is about whether their activity is just seen as the normal, the expected way of doing things. And all these different types of legitimacy play a role in how these entrepreneurs decide to operate.
So for our listeners who are trying to learn a lot in a short amount of time, this paper provides a really great framework for understanding this complex global phenomenon. It's not just black and white. There's a lot of nuance.
Yeah, hopefully this typology, these pathways, they give you some new ways to think about entrepreneurship. It's not just about the traditional formal businesses that we might think of.
And this definitely raises some interesting questions. I mean, when you think about these different types of entrepreneurs and how they can move between formality and informality, it makes you wonder about the best ways to support economic development.
Absolutely.
How can policymakers work with this huge part of the economy?
It's a big question, and it leads to a really interesting final thought. Given how big IE is globally, how dynamic it is, how diverse it is, wouldn't it be great if we could really understand it better? The different types of entrepreneurs, their goals, their journeys.
Yeah.
Maybe then we could create better ways to support economic opportunity and address some of the bigger challenges that we're all facing.
Absolutely. Food for thought.
Definitely. And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.